You're listening to Witch Wednesdays, your weekly podcast source for all things witchcraft in the modern world. Welcome back to Witch Wednesdays. I'm Steph, and I have a fun episode today to chat about the new Oracle deck that I have, which you may have already seen on my YouTube and Instagram. But if not, I did a whole unboxing that you can check out. And today I have the creator here with me to chat. So I am going to let her introduce herself and tell you where you can find her online and especially where you can find the deck.
Yeah, hi everyone. Hi Steph. Thanks so much for having me on. My name is Lisa Boletska. I'm an artist and writer and the creator of Glowwood, which is an oracle deck and companion book that are deeply rooted in forest ecology. And you can find Glowwood at Glowwood Cards on Instagram and at www.glowwoodcards.com.
Very nice. So thank you so much for being here. And I'm really glad that I have my hands on this deck because it is really beautiful and creative and not something that I personally have ever seen in a deck before. So I would love to hear just a little bit about that, of like where that idea even came from for you. Like, how did that happen? What was the process like? All of those things.
Yeah, thanks so much for the compliments, and thank you for filming such a beautiful overview of the deck on your YouTube. I just watched it yesterday. It was great. Highly recommend. Yeah, so Glowwood, just to give another little synopsis of what it is, it's a 78 card oracle deck. And it comes with a pretty involved companion guidebook and a little bag. And the 78 beings, as I call them in the deck, are plants, insects, fungi, lichens, minerals or soils, and one protist. And they interweave to form these readable landscapes, as I call them. And the book has these poetry and prose texts, spreads, personal philosophy, which is really an amalgamation of all the things I read and experienced since I first had the idea to make the deck, which was about 7 years ago now. And there's also this symbolic shorthand that's integrated into the design of the cards, which are these little icons around the borders that allow you to read the cards quickly and in a slightly different way without having to dive into the companion book. I'll give you the long story of Glowwood as well, but the short story of it is that the idea came from a kind of practical and a spiritual engagement with plants first specifically, and then with ecosystems more broadly. And I had the idea and then I sat on the idea for ages until about winter 2020, at which point I was actually able to finally sit down and make it. And yeah, it took about 9 months, which like appropriate gestation period. Though I have to say at times it felt more like being in labor, which I'm sure I can only make that comparison because I've never actually been in labor. But yeah, and sorry, I've forgotten what the other questions were. I felt like you had a couple, but
No, just wanted to hear the story of how that all got started and where your interest in sort of this idea of ecology and the forest from start to finish, where that came from for you. I mean, 9 months is a long time to develop the idea, but were you always just like a forest witch at heart?
No. So I guess to go into that more deeply, or to talk about that, I would have to sort of give you my whole story about how I embarked on a spiritual practice in general, which
we would love to hear that.
Yeah, so those things for me were really interwoven, especially at the beginning. Um, and I think a lot of people come to spiritual practice from trauma, and I do think that was true for me. So I was a couple years out of college and feeling generally pretty lost. And at that time, I kind of randomly came across transcendental meditation, which I have a complicated relationship with now, but it really catalyzed sort of a cascade of things. The practice did. A lot of repressed memories and latent stuff started coming up, and it was pretty painful and kind of re-traumatized me all over again, because these were things that were coming up that I had managed to suppress for a long while, using a lot of the arsenal of or the dysfunctional tool set that's often available to a young person. So I was dealing with this kind of effluent, but in a very conscious and pragmatic way. I felt through this meditation practice, I knew I wanted to sort of live through what was happening and not look away. And yeah, at that time, it really felt like my whole life was at stake. And yeah, I think at this sort of moment, it's pretty natural for humans to reach out to find something to sort of hold on to. And for me, that was literally reaching out and touching a hedgerow on my way to work, which,
Really?
yeah, it's kind of funny. I guess that makes me a hedge witch. But yeah, and at that time, this was 2015. I was living in a pretty industrial part of Houston, Texas. And I'd walk to work along Westheimer Road, which is this really busy street with buses and cars and pollution and no shade. It was a pretty grueling walk. And so I was walking and running my hand along this bush. And I experienced something I've called a visitation or an epiphany. And it was basically this realization that I'm not alone, that I'm surrounded by others who are also living here, who are also a bit alien maybe, but also very integrated, and that I can get to know them and they can be my friends, sort of. And I'm talking about plants here. So yeah, it was like a visitation of curiosity, the sudden curiosity about a whole kind of branch of life that up until that point, I really did not care at all about. I mean, I think before then, I honestly found nature pretty boring and kind of like a bit like assigned reading almost. So yeah, it felt really grand, this moment. I think I cried that morning on the way to work. It was like the sublime, sort of like it's described in 18th century writing, where there's this like ambivalent feeling of awe, the awesome and the awful. Awesome because what you're looking at is so great and kind of gigantic and boundless, but then it's also kind of terrifying for the same reason. Yeah, so after that, a lot of things changed. I mean, obviously, these kinds of things, you kind of look at them retrospectively and decide for yourself, like what the narrative of your life is going to sound like. So to me, I've isolated this moment as a turning point, but really, I think at that point too, it really felt like something happened. And what happened after that was gradual, but kind of still dramatic. I went from feeling really disoriented to feeling very guided. I wanted to know everything there was to know about plants all of a sudden, and also mushrooms and geology and ethnobotany, which is how people traditionally have used plants historically, and also like alternative farming practices like permaculture and biodynamic agriculture. and like environmental activism and basically anything that was to do with the topic. I was kind of all over the place. And then I also read a couple books that really sort of shook my world at the time. And that was this book called Staying with the Trouble by Donna Haraway, who is a feminist theoretician, but also kind of like does theory about science and plants. And she wrote this like pretty accessible, I think even to the layman, book about interspecies relationships. And I got that on pre-order, and it had this huge impact on me, as it did on many people who read it. And then I really wanted to like immediately express this new interest, honestly, through art or writing, which were the two things that I was trained in at school. And at that time I was getting into making computer art. I was working on these like virtual environments and side scroller games and things. So I thought that was pretty cool, expressing things about nature through technology. And then also there was like this didacticism about it. I wanted to evangelize about nature, and I felt like I could reach people, I could reach the masses with my message through computers. This was before I realized that I was making pretty niche things that like many people found kind of weird. So my scope was like a lot more limited than I fantasized with the things I was making back then. But you know, maybe I've finally done it with something like I don't know. I hope that people enjoy more, which is Glowwood. But I was. I think at that time I was also like a bit naive. There was this sort of like bright-eyed excitement that made me want to show other people what I had found, which was like nature, as though, you know, I discovered it myself. But I wanted to like share it before I had actually myself spent enough time with it. But I guess that's sort of like the artist's way. You see things and then filter them through yourself like a clam, and then some kind of artistic production comes out and everyone can see it. And you know, sometimes it's a bit like embarrassing. Something that this artist Claire Pentecost has called learning in public, or being a public amateur. But going back to the spiritual path narration, I had a pretty intense meditation practice back then, as per transcendental meditation doctrine. I was meditating every day, twice a day for 20 minutes, which ends up being actually like quite substantial. You know, that's like 40 minutes of your day.
I could never.
I think you have to like get into a sort of like religiosity about it to do it. You know, if you come to something like that in like a time of crisis, then you really hold on to it. And I think I also held on to like plants in that way for a while. You kind of like fear letting go of the thing that you feel saved you. So that really like gave me structure. But plants also, like besides structure, gave me a kind of shift. I was really focused on them and they felt really like absolute. I had a full-time job at that time. I was a translator and a voice actress for a math education technology company, which had absolutely nothing to do with plants. Yeah, very, very different area of life. So yeah, I felt some dissonance from that, kind of from my newfound interest and the way it was combining or like not combining with what I was spending most of my time doing. So yeah, then I made a lot of like quick life decisions that were a little scary and brought me into a more financially precarious place, but then I could be nearer to things that I was interested in. And that's also when I moved to Ukraine, which is over 6 years ago now, which is where I'm from originally, but moved away when I was a child. So yeah, I guess that's the sort of long story of how I got into plants. After I moved to Ukraine, I did a lot of hiking and field studies and organized this children's ecological summer camp in a village near Kiev. And I spent a year living kind of rurally and doing light farming according to some of those permaculture principles I had read about. I also lived on a buffalo rewilding project farm in Western Ukraine. That
Oh,
was
cool.
interesting. Yeah.
That'd be
um,
amazing.
yeah, it's a really cool project as well that was started by this a German sort of like self-taught ecologist who just decided to move to Ukraine and save a species of buffalo. So yeah, that's a lots can be said about that. He's
Wow.
super cool. But yeah, and I obviously like also met other people who were into nature, which is a big, like really important thing for me. And so at some point, actually pretty early on, around the time I was moving to Ukraine, I had this thought like, what if landscapes were like mood rings? And what if you could arrange pieces of an environment and then read them together, and the environment that you've arranged could tell you how you're feeling or give you insights into something you're thinking about? Um, and then that idea eventually turned into Glowwood, but that's how it started. And as I was thinking about making this, I found out that this thing that I'm thinking of making is actually called an Oracle card deck, and that I didn't just invent this genre. So that's when I started looking into what other people were doing and like reading about magic and getting to know the culture I started suddenly found myself participating in. Rambled on there a bit, but yeah, hopefully.
No, that's super interesting. You have quite a story behind it, and you have done a lot in your life. I am really impressed. All of these things. So I have a lot of follow-up questions. So first, let me ask, this is a little usually out of order of how I do this, but I would love, since you just brought up moving back to Ukraine, I would love to talk about what
Mm.
your daily life looks like right now. There is no typical day, but for you especially, I know your life has changed dramatically this year. So I would love to know what your daily life looks like. How are you still having any sort of witchy or spiritual things that you can do semi regularly? How are you managing that?
Sure. Yeah. So, as you might imagine, there has to be a walk in there somewhere. And it doesn't matter where the walk happens. But like you mentioned in your episode on urban witchcraft, forests don't exist in a vacuum. And so, my own journey started in an urban environment, my journey with nature, and it's also often continued in one. So last month, this daily walk was in a kind of sleeper neighborhood in Kiev in Ukraine. And there was this old stadium near the place where I was staying that was completely overgrown with wildflowers and different pioneer plants and invasive city plants. And it was just such a magical place, especially at dusk. And there was also this cultivated park nearby. So the species in the park were all selected by the city landscaping organization, which is really quite a fascinating entity. A few years back, I even wrote a poetic cycle with them, the power and protocols and history that go into populating the city's green spaces and the changes in soil composition and animal presence that those decisions bring about. That's a big branch of bureaucratic magic that I don't think a lot of people think about, but it's really something that like impacts our lives so dramatically.
Yeah, that's very
Um,
true.
yeah. But anyways, I tend to be pretty tied to a place, really. Like I think, most of us are. Um, but obviously the war has launched me into sort of a nomadic state for various reasons at various moments. I mean, it's this kind of escalation and uh, has been going on since February 24th. But since then, there have been kind of ebbs and flows, and like what's been happening in the areas that I lived in specifically. And, that's affected like my own choices about where I should be. So this summer, I was at this wonderful ecologically focused artist residency called 2020 in Finland, in rural Finland, about 200 kilometers north of Helsinki. And there, on my daily walks, I would meet bog plants and pines and lots of mosses and lichens. And then this month, I'm actually no longer in Kiev. I left at the end of August, and I'm in Tbilisi, which is the capital city of Georgia. This the country of Georgia. And my walk is now up a very steep slope of slate and limestone. And the kinds of plants that are surrounding me now are plants that are adapted to like dry and hot environments. So ephedra, and I've found fig trees with ripening figs. And yeah, it's interesting. You'd think that the plants here are like the polar opposite of the plants you'd find in wet bogs in Finland, but actually the um, the Finnish bogs or bogs in general have a very acidic composition because of the peat content, which is comparable to vinegar, which ultimately means that those plants also have to be really smart and conservative about water usage. And so their adaptations can look pretty similar, like reduced leaves covered in wax. So yeah, seeing these similarities between living things makes things a bit cozier when you're kind of up in the air. And sometimes the plants and animals that I meet in these places are variations of ones that I'm familiar with from home, and recognizing them feels really grounding. Yeah, so what I do on these walks really varies. Sometimes it's just an intuitive sensing of the environment, kind of like a mindfulness practice, but with special attention paid to the material composition of the environment and the little ecosystemic interrelations and arrangements that stand out to me. And just that can really start to bring in some messages and give guidance and point things out to you, especially if your walks are in the morning and then you have like a whole human day ahead of you. I find that then it starts to be guided by these experiences, which are really experiences of communicating with non-human beings, which of course is exactly what made up Glowwood. So sometimes I just let this sort of sensory information wash over me, and I just know it's doing stuff. Like I know it has an effect on what I do and what I see later, even if I don't articulate what it means in the moment specifically. And then sometimes during these walks, it's more of a conscious effort to convert this kind of pre-linguistic information into an actual human language, which still, of course, ends up being pretty symbolic or abstracted, something that's like halfway between the environment and myself, a kind of like interpretation of non-human communication or meaning making, since all nature is sort of doing that and representing the world in its own way. And recently I've been calling this language conversion symbolic play work. And again, this is the sort of practice that went into making Glowwood. And of course, I do hope that interacting with the cards and the book can inspire other people to do the same with their local environments. I think I say that in the companion book at some point, like the advanced level is, go out, make your own Glowwood and tell me about it, please.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I
And
love that because I mean, I can't imagine just living that sort of nomadic lifestyle. I think that would be hard for a lot of people. So I think that's kind of beautiful that you are able to find some common ground in all of these places that you're going to. And that common ground being the plants and things around you and really connecting that all in your own personal life.
yeah, for sure. And it only just occurred to me recently that, you know, sometimes like I'm human, so my interests do change, but I've realized that like I came to this world that I was engaged with for so long, from a kind of, again, like a place of, I guess, trauma or like instability. And I'm realizing now, like 7 years later, that it's always there for me and that I can always kind of return to it, especially in these sorts of times. So I'm finding it still like really appropriate for the application that I first found it to be appropriate for. And I really, I'm noticing that other people who maybe weren't so confident about like turning to nature with their troubles or like with their questions, that is something that's like close to them. I have found that people are like also able to find that through Glowwood, and also through just like first opening up to that through Glowwood, and then going out and making their own sort of path and way in nature.
Yeah, and I think that's especially interesting, like perspective coming from you and from Glowwood, considering that you weren't always like that. It wasn't always a part of your personality to reach out and be in nature like that. And I think a lot of witches are sort of detached from nature in our modern times. But yeah, like I mentioned in that other episode, like it doesn't exist in a vacuum. Like we are nature. We are part of it. We are out there. So it's really interesting to hear from somebody that, it wasn't always like this for you, and it can be found later in life.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that like from the perspective of sort of, I don't know, mainstream magic, if there's a thing like that, I have a pretty secular practice. To me, witchcraft, but also art in general, is about reimagining spaces or relationships or like your environment, and finding new frameworks to think with, which like maybe you could call that attunement as well. And of course, like I find the potential sort of paradigm shifts that are sown into the natural world, that they're super powerful. And I think that they're so all the more powerful because they're so accessible. And if you think that you're like removed from these types of messages, you can I like this exercise. One of my friends shared it with me. Like you could look around your room right now and consider all of the materials that surround you. And like what are they actually? What was their life like before they became materials? Each single life is a store of ideas, or like is a life way, as is popular to say nowadays. And each one of these life ways could change what is currently visible to you. And, like maybe I'm talking about the life of rocks right now, but like rocks have a life too. um, and yeah, I did have a moment of trying to do like practical ritual magic. I had a short-lived chaos magic phase sort of at the beginning of my like when I first found out about magic, but none of that stuff really seemed very right to me. Like when I was doing it, didn't really feel like my thing. And now I mostly think about kind of like the enchantment of the world itself. I think certain people certain dispositions find that things can get a bit desaturated when you're not looking, like colorless. And so re-enchantment is somehow always necessary. And to me, paying attention to the living world is one way to do that. But yeah, and again, as you said in that episode about urban witchcraft, I really like that you were talking about like ways to access sort of the outdoors or nature while in the city, because I think that's so important, and really is like the reality that most of us live in. But ecosystemic thinking really has to have you look at everything in complex, and that includes like soil and rocks and water and wind, and that really opens up like what we mean by natural ecosystems. But it could also maybe lend itself to a sort of enchantment of urban spaces, thinking about like history and materials and sites of resources, and how they flow. I think all of that is also like very ecological and very, ecosystemic too. I would love to do an urban version of Glowwood at some point.
Oh, that would be a very cool idea. I would want to see that. Absolutely. I think you should do it.
All right.
I love how you know, talk about your craft and Glowwood and re-enchantment. You really speak like an artist, like everything that you say, which in my mind does not work that way at all. Like I wish I could be more of an artist and have that artistic nature, but it's something I'm working on. It's not in me, but I just love the way how you like talk about that, because I feel like you have like your mind works like an artist. I think that's just beautiful to chat with somebody who's so different from me.
Oh, well, thank you. And I think it's nice to have like all sorts of different people and kind of share our systems of thought. I think that's the nicest, is like making bridges.
I agree. And I would love to ask you, it's sort of a final question, if you have any advice for beginner witches and beginner artists, because that comes up a lot, that people want to incorporate art into their witchcraft and have no idea where to even start doing that. Do you have any advice that you would offer for beginners?
Sure. So I was actually always it's a shock reveal. I was actually always more of a writer. I only started doing visual art in college. And then after that, I identified myself as an artist who writes, or an artist who also writes. Identification seemed a lot more important to me back then than it is now to me. But yeah, to me, art and making art isn't really exactly about materially creating things. It's rather about perspective or cultivating different practices of seeing. I think that's the fun part. And then figuring out how to communicate these things is the more craft side of things. And I find that slightly more boring, or alternatively, I could get really hung up on it, like trying to figure out like what the perfect way to communicate it is. So I try to, this is the advice I would also give myself. I try to let it happen intuitively, this craft side. It's like, what's the least painful way I could tell someone else about what I'm seeing? So I would suggest to incorporate more art into your practice. try to cultivate more curiosity about some aspect of reality, dig into it a little bit. I think, the more interesting discoveries tend to be slightly further down the rabbit hole, but I'm sure Witch Wednesdays listeners should have no problem with that.
It's true. They love to go down the rabbit hole.
Right. And then the other half of it is trying to document this experience in some way. And I would just suggest using anything that seems easy, because that's what you'll actually do. Manipulating matter, like material objects, frustrates me personally. So I gravitated to digital art at first, and then I moved on to writing, which both seem to me like molecularly light mediums. But yeah, and then I guess a final piece of advice is, I feel like there's so much information and guidance and takes and stuff out there nowadays. I would advise anyone starting out to follow your interest, and only your interest, and to not be ashamed of it, whatever it is, because whatever it is, if you dig deep enough into it, there's something amazing waiting for you down there, or up there, but it's specifically waiting for you, and only you can go there. So it's sort of your responsibility to follow.
It's really great advice. I like that. Oh, Lisa, thank you so much for being here today, for all of your advice, for sharing your story. Again, I will have everything linked over at Witch Wednesdays, so you can find the Glowwood deck. If you haven't seen it yet, I will definitely link my YouTube video and Lisa's website, so you can see all of the beautiful, beautiful cards. But thank you again for sharing everything and just for being here. I really appreciate everything that you offered.
Steph, thank you so much. I had a great time.
And listeners, that is everything that I have for you this week. I will see you next time. Need even more? Subscribe to Patreon and YouTube for exclusive bonus content. Order a themed witchcraft box every month through Witch Wednesdays on Etsy. Be sure to follow on Instagram at Witch Wednesdays Podcast. Find all these links and more at witchwednesdays.com.